Hello, and welcome back to Final Course, where we explore the incredible stories and sometimes the tragic endings of culinary artists who leave a lasting mark. It's wonderful to have you at the table with us again. Before we serve today's story, I want to extend a huge thank you to our amazing subscribers. Your passion for these narratives is truly the secret ingredient of this channel. If you're new here and have a taste for compelling stories about creativity, ambition, and the human element behind the food we love, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications. You won't want to miss what we have on the menu. A disclaimer before we begin. The story you are about to hear is a work of fiction. The characters, restaurants, locations, and events portrayed are entirely the product of the imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to actual events, is purely coincidental. A promising chef is more than just a cook. They are an artist, a storyteller, a creator of joy. Their kitchen is their sanctuary. But what happens when the place they call home becomes the most dangerous place of all? Today, we tell the story of Maya Costa, a brilliant young chef on the cusp of greatness, whose bright future was extinguished by the twisted obsession of her landlord, in a heinous crime that would leave an entire community with a bitter, lasting aftertaste. Maya Costa believed in the alchemy of food. She believed that a simple dish, crafted with intention and respect, could do more than just nourish the body. It could transport the soul. She could take a humble root vegetable and, through the magic of slow roasting and precise seasoning, make it taste like a warm childhood memory. She could combine spices in a way that would evoke the scent of a bustling foreign market you'd never visited. She was not just a chef. She was a culinary storyteller, and at 26, she was on the verge of writing her masterpiece. Her story and her tragic end began with a building. The Rockwell was one of those rare architectural gems that had somehow survived the city's relentless march towards glass and steel. It was a pre-war, 6-story walk-up with a charmingly ornate facade, large, light-filled apartments, and floors that creaked with the weight of a century of stories. For the community of artists, writers, students, and young professionals who lived there, the Rockwell was more than just a place to live. It was a sanctuary, a haven of affordable character in a city that was rapidly losing its soul. Maya had fallen in love with it instantly. Apartment 4B was her perfect blank canvas. A small one-bedroom with a surprisingly spacious, if dated, kitchen, and a large bay window that overlooked a quiet, tree-lined street. This, she had decided, was where her dream would take root. The dream was ephemer, a pop-up dining series she would host in her own apartment. It was a bold, audacious plan. She would transform her small living room into an intimate, 10-seat restaurant for one night a month, serving an elaborate tasting menu based on a specific theme or memory. It was a way to bypass the crushing expense of a brick-and-mortar restaurant and build a name for herself on her own terms, with her own undiluted vision. The gatekeeper to this dream, and the silent, brooding monarch of the Rockwell, was its landlord, Mr. Arthur Abernathy. Abernathy was a man who seemed to be composed entirely of shades of gray. He wore gray, neatly pressed trousers, a gray button-down shirt, and a gray cardigan regardless of the season. His hair was a thin, gray wisper, combed meticulously across a pale scalp. Even his eyes were a flat, washed-out gray, like stones at the bottom of a stagnant pond. He was the building's owner and sole custodian, having inherited it from his parents. He lived on the ground floor, in an apartment that was a mirror image of the building's lobby. Obsessively clean, eerily silent, and devoid of any personal touch. He moved through the Rockwell like a ghost, his soft-soled shoes making no sound on the old wooden floors. He was a creature of routine and absolute control. He polished the brass mailboxes every morning at precisely 7 a.m. He swept the front steps every evening at 6 p.m. He knew the comings and goings of every tenant, not through overt spying, but through a kind of quiet, atmospheric absorption. He was the building, and the building was him. Its peace, its order, its quiet, monastic character were extensions of his own psyche. Maya's first meeting with him had been unnerving. He had interviewed her for the apartment not as a prospective tenant, but as a candidate for a very exclusive club. He had asked probing, strangely personal questions about her lifestyle, her working hours, her propensity for social gatherings. "The Rockwell is a quiet building, Miss Costa," he had said, his voice a low, dry rustle of old paper. "We value our peace. We are a community of considerate individuals." Maya, eager to secure the apartment, had assured him she was a quiet, focused professional. She would later realize with a chilling irony, presented herself as the perfect, unobtrusive tenant he was looking for. She had not mentioned her plan for Ephemera. She moved in, and for the first few months, her interactions with Abernathy were minimal and strange. He would appear silently in the hallway as she was leaving, offering a curt nod. He once let himself into her apartment to fix a dripping faucet she hadn't even reported yet, explaining that he had heard it from the apartment below. He had fixed it with a surgeon's precision, but he had lingered, his gray eyes scanning her kitchen, taking in her collection of copper pots, her rack of gleaming knives, the jars of spices she had begun to arrange. "A lot of equipment for a woman who lives alone," he had commented, his tone unreadable. "I love to cook," Maya had replied with a bright, slightly nervous smile. "Cooking creates odors," he had stated, not as an observation, but as a soft, veiled warning. "And attracts vermin. One must be meticulous." The first Ephemera dinner was a resounding success. The theme was childhood summers, and 10 guests were crowded happily into her small living room, their faces glowing in the candlelight. Maya served a 7-course menu that included a deconstructed tomato soup with a grilled cheese foam that tasted like after-school snacks, and a dessert of smoked marshmallow ice cream that perfectly captured the scent of a bonfire. The apartment was filled with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the fragrant, delicious aromas of Maya's art. It was everything she had dreamed of. The next morning, there was a note under her door. It was typed on a small, white card, the font a severe, old-fashioned Times New Roman. A reminder: the Rockwell lease agreement, Section 7B, explicitly prohibits the operation of a commercial enterprise from a residential unit. Furthermore, please be considerate of your neighbors regarding excessive noise and lingering cooking odors after 10 p.m. There was no signature, but none was needed. Maya was shaken but also defiant. She was not running a business in the traditional sense. She was hosting a private dinner party for which her guests contributed to the cost of the ingredients. It was a gray area, and she was determined to push through. Her dream was more powerful than a passive-aggressive note. She sought out her neighbor and new friend, Lena, an artist who lived in 4D. Lena was a whirlwind of color and chaotic energy, the polar opposite of Mr. Abernathy. "Oh, honey, that's just Abernathy," Lena said, waving a paint-splattered hand dismissively. "He's the king of creepy, typed notes. He once left me one about the improper disposal of tea bags. The man is a control freak. Just ignore him. What he doesn't know won't hurt him." So Maya pressed on. The second dinner, a rainy night in Paris, was even more successful. A local food blogger attended and wrote a glowing review, calling Maya the city's most exciting new culinary voice, and Ephemera a magical, secret experience. The secret, however, was now out. The waiting list for a seat at her table exploded. This was a fundamental disruption to Abernathy's ordered kingdom. The Rockwell was no longer his quiet, predictable sanctuary. On one night a month, it became a place of pilgrimage for strangers. The lobby, his sacred, polished space, was trespassed by people he did not know, people who laughed too loudly and brought the chaotic energy of the outside world into his hermetically sealed environment. His harassment escalated, but it was always deniable, a campaign of psychological warfare waged with subtlety. A package of expensive, perishable ingredients for her next dinner mysteriously disappeared from the front hall. Her mail was sometimes delivered to her opened with a thin, typed slip of paper inside reading, "Delivered to wrong address by mistake." He would appear in the hallway more frequently, a silent, gray sentinel, his eyes following her as she carried in groceries, his expression a flat, blank wall of disapproval. The true turning point, The moment that simmering resentment began its slow, inexorable journey to a boil, came on a brisk autumn afternoon. Maya had been offered a feature in a prominent lifestyle magazine. A photographer was coming to shoot her in her apartment, to capture the unique magic of ephemera. It was the kind of exposure that could change her life, that could elevate her from a secret pop-up to a culinary star. Abernathy found the photographer setting up his lights in the hallway outside her apartment. "This is a private residence, not a photography studio," Abernathy said, his voice a low, cold hum. "You will pack your equipment and you will leave immediately." Maya, hearing the commotion, came to the door. "Mr. Abernathy, it's fine," she said, trying to keep her voice light and reasonable. "He's with me. It's for a magazine article. It will only take an hour." Abernathy turned his flat, gray eyes on her, and for the first time, she saw something beyond quiet disapproval. She saw a deep, possessive, and utterly chilling rage. It was the rage of a monarch whose authority had been publicly challenged. "You were approved as a tenant, Miss Costa, based on a certain understanding of your character," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "You presented yourself as a quiet individual. You have violated that understanding. You have violated the character of this building. You are a disruption, a stain, a stain." Maya repeated, her own anger now rising. "I host a quiet dinner party once a month. I am a better tenant than half the people in this building. I pay my rent on time, and I am not bothering anyone. You are bothering me," he hissed, the word a venomous dart. "This is my home. These are my rules. This performance will stop, or your tenancy will be terminated." He turned and walked away, his back a rigid, unyielding line of fury. The photographer, thoroughly spooked, packed his bags and left. The magazine feature was cancelled. That night, Maya told Lena what had happened. "He's not just a control freak, Lena," she said, her voice trembling. "He's unhinged. The way he looked at me, it was like he hated me. Truly, deeply hated me. You need to get out of here, Maya," Lena urged, her usual flippancy gone, replaced by a genuine fear. "Break your lease. I'll help you find a new place. That man is not right in the head." But Maya was stubborn, and she was so close. An influential food critic and a potential investor were booked for her next dinner, the Taste of Memory. It was in 2 weeks. This was her one big shot. If she could just get through this one last dinner, she would have the capital and the clout to leave the Rockwell and open her own, real restaurant. She would escape. "Just one more dinner," Maya said, her voice a mixture of determination and dread. "I'm not going to let that strange, sad little man ruin my dream. After this dinner, I'm gone." She did not realize that in Abernathy's twisted, proprietary mind, she was not a tenant who could simply leave. She was a part of his collection. A flawed, disruptive part, perhaps, but his nonetheless. And he, the silent, obsessive curator of the Rockwell, was not about to let his most prized and most hated possession simply walk away. The simmering pot of his resentment was about to reach a violent, rolling boil. The 2 weeks leading up to Maya's final dinner were a masterclass in psychological torture. Arthur Abernathy, having been openly defied, shed the last of his thin veneer of propriety and descended into a campaign of quiet, relentless terror. He was no longer just a creepy landlord. He was a phantom, a constant, menacing presence that seeped into every corner of Maya's life. He started by exploiting his greatest weapon, his master key. Maya would return home to find small, unsettling changes in her apartment. A cookbook left open to a page on butchering. A single, gleaming chef's knife laid out on her kitchen counter, separate from the others in the block. Her carefully organized spice rack would be in disarray. The jars of cumin and paprika switched, a subtle act of chaos injected into her ordered world. Nothing was ever taken. Nothing was ever broken. The acts were designed to be deniable, to make her feel like she was losing her mind. She would tell Lena, "He was in my apartment again." And Lena would urge her to call the police, but what could she say? "A man moved my spice jars?" She knew how it would sound. The typed notes became more frequent, more personal. They were no longer about lease violations, but about her. The scent of garlic is particularly pervasive. It clings to the curtains. Constant chopping. A rhythmic, unpleasant sound. It disturbs the peace. Ambition is a corrosive acid, Ms. Costa. It eats away at the character of a place. He was watching her, listening to her, cataloging her every move. She began to feel like a specimen under a microscope. The sense of sanctuary she had once felt in her apartment was gone, replaced by a constant, low-grade hum of fear. She started barricading the door at night with a chair, a flimsy defense that offered more psychological comfort than actual security. She felt hunted in her own home. Her dream of Ephemere, the thing that had once been her greatest joy, was now her only source of strength, the one thing she could focus on to drown out the fear. This final dinner had to be perfect. It was her escape route. The menu, the taste of memory, was her most personal and ambitious yet. Each of the 7 courses was tied to a specific, formative memory from her life. A sophisticated take on the seafood stew her fisherman grandfather used to make, a lamb dish seasoned with wild herbs from the hills behind her childhood home, a dessert that deconstructed the flavors of the honey cakes her mother baked every holiday. It was her entire life, distilled onto a series of plates. She threw herself into the preparations with a frantic, desperate energy, her kitchen becoming the only place she felt a semblance of control. The night of the dinner arrived. As the guests began to file in, a mix of excited foodies, the influential critic, and the potential investor, Maya felt a surge of triumphant adrenaline. She had done it. She had weathered the storm. The apartment was once again transformed, a warm, glowing haven of candlelight and soft music. The air was filled with delicious, welcoming aromas. For this one night, she was banishing the gray, oppressive ghost of Arthur Abernathy. She saw him, of course. As the last guest arrived, she caught a glimpse of his silhouette in the darkened window of his ground-floor apartment, a motionless figure watching the proceedings. The sight sent a cold shiver down her spine, but she pushed it away. He was down there, and she was up here, surrounded by people, by joy, by her art. She was safe. The dinner was a triumph. The guests were enraptured. The critic was scribbling furiously in his notebook, a small, knowing smile on his face. The investor, a sharp, well-dressed woman named Ms. Davenport, was clearly impressed, asking insightful questions about Maya's business plan between courses. With every plate she served, with every gasp of pleasure from her guests, Maya felt herself ascending, leaving the Rockwell and its twisted custodian far behind. The final course, the honey cake dessert, was served. The guests lingered, sipping coffee and wine, their praise a warm, intoxicating balm on Maya's frayed nerves. By midnight, they were gone. Ms. Davenport had stayed behind for a moment. "That was more than a meal, Maya," she had said, her voice full of genuine admiration. "That was a story. We'll be in touch on Monday. I think we can build something wonderful together." After she left, Maya stood alone in the center of her living room, a scene of happy devastation. Empty glasses, crumpled napkins, plates scraped clean. She was exhausted, but she was electric with a feeling of pure, unadulterated victory. She had done it. She was free. She began to clean, the familiar, meditative rhythm of restoring order to her kitchen a comfort. She scraped plates, loaded the dishwasher, and began to wash her most precious tools, her knives by hand. The building had fallen into its usual deep, nighttime silence. The only sound was the soft splash of water in her sink. That's why she heard it, the faintest, softest click. The sound of her apartment door, which she had locked and bolted, being unlocked. She froze, her heart instantly seizing in her chest. The water ran over her hands, forgotten. She turned slowly, her hand still holding a small, razor-sharp paring knife. Arthur Abernathy stood in the doorway of her living room. He was holding his set of master keys in one hand. He closed the door behind him with a quiet, final click, and slid the bolt shut. He was not angry. His face was unervingly, terrifyingly calm. It was the placid, focused expression of a craftsman about to begin a delicate, necessary task. "Abernathy?" Maya whispered, her voice a dry, rasping sound. "What are you doing? Get out of my apartment." "Our apartment, Miss Costa," he corrected her, his voice a low, even murmur. He began to walk slowly towards her. "Everything in the Rockwell belongs to me. I am its curator, its protector." "I'm calling the police," Maya said, her eyes darting towards her phone on the counter. "I think not," he said, his gaze following hers. He moved with a surprising quickness, snatching the phone and placing it in his pocket. "This is a private matter, a matter of housekeeping." He was in the kitchen now, standing only a few feet from her. The scent of her dinner, of her success, still lingered in the air. He wrinkled his nose in distaste. "You have filled my building with noise," he said, his voice dropping lower, taking on a strange, hypnotic cadence. "With strangers, with flavors. You have disrespected the quiet harmony of this place. You have disrespected me." "I'm leaving," Maya said, trying to keep her voice from breaking, holding the small paring knife up in a trembling, useless gesture of defense. "After tonight, I'm gone. You'll have your quiet back." A thin, cold smile touched his lips. "That is where you are mistaken. You see, the problem is not your presence, but your influence. You have changed things. You have left a stain, a memory. Even if you left, the memory of your disruption would linger. It would be an imperfection. And I do not tolerate imperfections." He looked at the paring knife in her hand with an almost pitiful expression. "That is a tool for creating, Miss Costa, and your time for creation is over. Now is the time for cleansing." He lunged. He was shockingly strong, his thin, wiry arms like bands of steel. He grabbed her wrist, twisting it brutally until she cried out in pain and the paring knife clattered to the floor. He pinned her against the counter, his face close to hers. His breath was cold and odorless. His gray eyes were like two dead stars. "I am going to restore the quiet," he whispered, his voice a sibilant hiss in her ear. "I am going to erase the stain." What happened next was a blur of primal, unimaginable horror. He was not a frenzied killer. He was a methodical, precise monster. He saw her not as a person, but as a problem to be dismantled. His crime was a heinous, twisted inversion of her art. She was a chef, a creator who brought things together to make something beautiful. He was a destroyer, a creature of grim subtraction. He used her kitchen, her sanctuary, as his abattoir. He used her own tools, the gleaming knives she had cared for with such reverence, as his instruments. The act was one of utter, possessive defilement. He was not just ending her life. He was systematically deconstructing her identity, her passion, her very essence. When it was over, the silence that fell was absolute. It was the profound, empty silence of a vacuum. Arthur Abernathy stood in the center of the destroyed kitchen, his breathing even, his gray cardigan remarkably clean. He looked around the room, at the horrific evidence of his cleansing, with a look of quiet, profound satisfaction. The disruption had been silenced. The stain was being removed. He then began the final, most meticulous phase of his plan. He was a cleaner, a restorer of order. He worked through the rest of the night with a tireless, obsessive focus. He cleaned the apartment with industrial chemicals he had brought up from his basement workshop, erasing every trace of the struggle, every drop of blood. He packed Maya's essential belongings, her clothes, her laptop, her personal effects into suitcases. He wrapped her body, and the tools he had used, in heavy-duty plastic sheeting. As the first, pale light of dawn began to creep over the city, Arthur Abernathy made several trips down the back service stairs to his car, which was parked in the alley. He was just another quiet, early-rising landlord, going about his business. No one saw him. No one heard him. He drove to a remote, desolate stretch of industrial wasteland on the edge of the city, a place of abandoned factories and illegal dumping sites. There, in the cold morning mist, he disposed of his terrible cargo. He returned to the Rockwell as the city was waking up. He went back to apartment 4B. The kitchen was unnaturally, chemically clean. The living room was empty. It looked as though a tenant had simply packed their bags and vanished in the middle of the night. He took out a small, typed card and a piece of tape. He affixed the card to the outside of the door. It read, "Apartment for rent. Inquire within." He then returned to his own apartment on the ground floor. He showered, changed into a fresh gray shirt and cardigan, and at precisely 7 a.m., he took out his polishing cloth and began to shine the brass mailboxes in the lobby. The order was restored. The quiet had returned. The Rockwell was his again. For 3 days, the universe seemed to conspire with Arthur Abernathy. The Rockwell was quieter than it had been in months. A placid, undisturbed tomb. The typed for rent sign on Maya Costa's door was the only testament to the fact that she was gone. To the other tenants, it was an abrupt but not entirely unbelievable departure. Maya was an ambitious young woman. It was plausible that she had received a sudden, life-changing offer and had left without a formal goodbye. The first person to feel the jagged edge of the truth was Lena. She had texted Maya the morning after the dinner. "You were a rock star last night. How did it go with the investor? Call me." The text remained unread. A follow-up call went straight to a voicemail that was full. By the second day, Lena's friendly concern had curdled into a cold, gnawing anxiety. Maya was not the type of person to disappear. She was meticulously professional. She would never ghost an investor, and she would never leave without a word to her closest friend. On the third day, Lena, armed with a spare key Maya had given her, let herself into apartment 4B. The apartment was eerily silent and sterile. The air had a faint, sharp chemical smell like a hospital. It was unnaturally tidy. The living room was empty of furniture. But the kitchen was what made Lena's blood run cold. Maya's prized copper pots were gone. Her cookbooks were gone. But her knife block, the beautiful custom-made walnut block, was still on the counter. And it was empty. Every single slot was vacant. Lena knew, with a certainty that defied logic and embraced a primal, terrifying intuition, that Maya had not left this apartment willingly. A chef, a true chef like Maya, would sooner leave behind her own arm than her set of knives. She backed out of the apartment, her heart hammering against her ribs, and called the police. The initial missing persons report was handled with a routine, bureaucratic indifference. But it landed on the desk of Detective Frank Harding, a man whose weary, seen-it-all demeanor concealed a bulldog-like tenacity and a keen eye for the dissonant details of a crime scene. Harding had been a detective for 20 years. He had a finely tuned instinct for when a story didn't add up. He started at the Rockwell. His first interview was with Arthur Abernathy. The landlord was the picture of civic-minded cooperation. He sat in his Spartan, obsessively neat apartment and recounted his version of events with a calm, believable sincerity. "A lovely girl, Detective," Abernathy said, his hands folded neatly in his lap. "Very ambitious. She came to me the night of her party very late. Said she'd received a sudden, wonderful offer. A restaurant in Chicago, I believe. She was leaving immediately. She paid me cash to break her lease and was gone before dawn. I was sad to see her go, of course, but happy for her success. It was a perfect story. It was plausible, it explained the empty apartment, and it painted Abernathy as a helpful, understanding landlord. But Harding felt a small, insistent itch of doubt. He had seen the preliminary report. A chef who moves across the country for a new job doesn't abandon her professional tools. His interview with Lena solidified his suspicions. She gave him a frantic, tearful, but detailed account of Abernathy's escalating harassment. The notes, the strange inspections, the veiled threats, the final, chilling confrontation over the magazine photographer. She showed him the log of incidents she and Maya had started to keep. He hated her, Detective, Lena insisted, her eyes wide with a mixture of grief and fear. He hated her success. He called her a stain. You have to look at him. Please. Harding now had a motive and a person of interest. He secured a warrant and brought in a forensic team to go over apartment 4B. What they found, or rather what they didn't find, was damning. The place had been cleaned, but it had been cleaned too well. Using advanced chemical agents, the team found microscopic traces of bleach and industrial-grade cleaning solvents, particularly in the kitchen, in concentrations far beyond normal household use. And under a loose floorboard beneath the sink, they found a single, dark brown hair. But the most critical discovery came from the building's basement. In a dark, forgotten corner of a damp, cobweb-filled storage cellar, tucked behind an old, disused water heater, a forensics officer found a small, black trash bag. Inside was a collection of cleaning supplies, a set of heavily stained rags, and a pair of worn leather work gloves. The stains on the rags were tested. The results came back positive for human blood. The DNA from the blood, and from the single hair found under the floorboard, was a perfect match to the DNA from a hairbrush the police had collected from Maya's parents. The net was closing, but Harding still didn't have a body. He needed to break Abernathy. He brought him back in for a second interview. This time, the mood was different. It was not a conversation. It was an interrogation. Harding laid out the evidence, piece by piece, on the cold metal table between them. The log of harassment, the chemical traces in the apartment, the blood-stained rags from the basement. Abernathy remained impassive, his composure a fortress of stone. He denied everything. He claimed the rags were from a plumbing leak. He suggested Maya had been having a secret, violent affair. He was a masterful, pathological liar. The break came from an unexpected place. While the interrogation was happening, a team of detectives was executing a search warrant on Abernathy's own apartment. It was, as expected, unnaturally clean. But in his small, meticulously organized workshop in the back, they found his collection of tools. And on a bench grinder in the corner, a forensic technician found something: microscopic metal shavings. The shavings were analyzed and found to be from a high-carbon steel alloy, the exact type used in the high-end, custom-made chef's knives that Maya's parents had described giving her as a graduation gift. He hadn't just used the knives. He had systematically destroyed them, grinding the blades down to nothing, erasing the murder weapons. It was a final, damning piece of the puzzle. Harding slid the forensics report across the table. Abernathy looked at the technical data, and for the first time, a crack appeared in his gray, stony facade. It was a flicker of something, a momentary loss of control. He had been so meticulous about the biological evidence, but he had overlooked the microscopic. His obsession with order had, in the end, betrayed him. "She was a stain, Detective," Abernathy said suddenly, his voice no longer a dry rustle but a low, intense hiss. The dam had broken. The confession that followed was not one of remorse, but of righteous justification. "She was a disease in the body of my building. The noise, the smells, the ambition. It was a cancer. I did not kill a person. I performed a surgery. I restored the health of the Rockwell. I restored the quiet. I did what was necessary." He spoke of the murder with a chilling, detached pride, describing the details not as a horrific crime, but as a difficult, unpleasant, but ultimately successful restoration project. He saw himself not as a murderer, but as a hero, the noble protector of his own small kingdom. And in that moment, Harding saw the true, banal face of a monster. Abernathy, assured by his confession that the police would now understand his motives, told them where he had left Maya's body. The discovery in the desolate wasteland shook the entire community to its core. The story of the promising chef and her twisted landlord became a city-wide sensation, a dark, cautionary tale about the monsters that hide in plain sight. The Rockwell was no longer a charming sanctuary. It was a crime scene, its character forever stained by the heinous act committed within its walls. The tenants moved out, one by one, unable to live with the ghosts. The building sat empty, a monument to a quiet man's loud, violent madness. Maya Costa's legacy was not the one she had dreamed of. She would not be remembered for the restaurants she would have opened or the culinary movements she might have led. But she was not forgotten. In the hearts of those who had tasted her food, who had sat at her table for one magic